possible to avert this development. As Nixon recalled, Burns urgently recommended that 2 steps be taken immediately: by loosening up on credit, and where justifiable, by increasing spending for national security. 10 years later, at Nixon's first opportunity he knew he would get for the Federal Reserve, Burns's tenure is widely regarded as a failure, in large part owing to his acquiescence to Nixon's denomination. The recently published Burns diaries are filled with references to a close personal and emotional proximity between Burns and Nixon to raise modern eyebrows. The policy proprieties of that relationship. A few examples illustrate the point. Nixon told Burns about this appointment of prominent Democrat John Connally as Secretary of the Treasury, before announcing publicly that told Burns that Connally, a politician, not an economist or businessman, would learn the ropes of his new position from Burns. Burns attended cabinet meetings, and his speeches vetted Nixon's staff, cleared his talking points with the president ahead of meeting with another central bankers in Basel, Switzerland, advised Nixon on tax, wage, and other fiscal policy, and made pledges to remain the president's true friend on economic policies before the public. We could of course make a similar list concerning Essel's proximity to Roosevelt. What made the Nixon-Burns relationship so unusual was Nixon's paranoid leadership style and the pressure that it brought to bear on Burns. One of the most confusing and intriguing parts of the Burns chapter in Fed's history is that even while being beguiled, even while being bullied by the Nixon administration, he intoned regularly on the importance of the independence of the monetary authority. This declaration of independence was a thorn in the side of the Wright-Patman, a member of the House of Representatives from Texas and Constant Scourge. As we will see in the next chapter of the Federal Reserve, Burns' insistence, seems spelled different, insistencies, proclivity, that the Fed was and should be independent, even after he coordinated monetary policy for Nixon's electoral ends, gave Patman even more fodder in his moldecade. Nice. Mulch. Fertilizer. Moldecade. Salt on the Fed. Burns duplicitous. Yeah, that's not right, is it? Duplicants is what I would have wrote. But no. Duplicitous. Yeah, duplicitous, I bet. I fucking bet it's duplicitous assertions of Fed independence were an arrogance we must not tolerate. No man or institution should have this unbridled power. The people did not elect Dr. Burns, and he is not our king. In one unfortunate exchange reported by Nixon's former chief of staff, Bob Ehrlichman, after the fact and perhaps with an axe to grind, we see an eager participant in bending of monetary policy toward Nixon's electoral prospects. My relations with the Fed Nixons allegedly told Burns will be differently than they were. Former Fed Chair William McChesney Martin there. He was always 6 months too late doing anything. I'm counting on you, Arthur, to keep us out of a recession. Yes, Mr. President, Burns is said to have responded, pipe in his mouth. I don't like to be late. We don't have to rely on others, perhaps skewed accounts of this dysfunctional relationship. Burns' attachment to Nixon, in spite of abuse of cognitive dissonance. Nice. Cognitive dissonance is perhaps most salient in his diary from the time. In one long passage, Burns records a conversation he had with Nixon in the late in the president's second term, as the scandal and political crisis fell down on Nixon. Burns was there to reassure him. The passage is worth quoting at length. RN is Richard Nixon, WH is White House. I informed the president as follows. 1, that the friendship was one of the 3 that counted most in my life, and that I wanted to keep if I possibly could. 2, is that I took the president post to repay the debt of an immigrant boy to a nation that had given him the opportunity to develop, use his brains constructively. 3, that there was never the slightest conflict between doing what was right for the economy and doing what served the political interests of RN. 4, that if a conflict ever arose between these objectives, I would not lose a minute in informing RN and seeking a solution together. 5, that the sniping in the press, what the WH staff was engaged in, had not the slightest influence on Fed policy. I still will be moved on the evidence that the Fed is not serving the nation's best interest. 6, that the WH staff had created an atmosphere of confrontation which led to the exaggeration of said differences about economy policy may exist between the Fed and administration. That 7, squabbling or the appearance of squabbling among the high government officers could lead to a weakening of confidence in government policy and thereby injure the prospects of economic improvement. Although some scholars argue that Burns' close proximity to Richard Nixon became clear only with hindsight, the Nixon tapes and other public contemporaneous accounts make clear that the personal connection between the two was strong and strongly influenced by Nixon's desire to control policy considerations. In terms of presidential control of the Fed, the Nixon era was a success for the president, a failure for the Fed and Arthur Burns. Next subject, not yet, but it does illustrate an important point of reality of political influence on the Federal Reserve. A political can control the Fed by sheer force of personality. It is anti-example that Fed chairs should consider in their relationship with the executive. Next subject, reverse control Bill Clinton and the Greenspan Fed. The third model to consider is not actually presidential control of the Fed, but the control of the president. The Clinton-Greenspan years were marked one by one of the most noticeable periods of central bank and presidential cooperation. In the nation's history, this is all the more remarkable because of the fact there was no genuine domestic financial crisis that required close coordination that we would expect from central banks and the Treasury, as explained in Chapter 7 earlier. Instead, the Greenspan Fed was the Clinton administration, worked hand in glove to battle the international financial crisis, and perhaps even more important, to determine domestic fiscal policy. The truly noteworthy aspect of this cooperation, though, was not that it occurred. Fed chairs and presidents have conferred on fiscal matters before, as we have just seen. What was different that hand the Greenspan's glove Bill Clinton's more than other time in our history. During the Greenspan-Clinton years, the Fed was in charge and the president played catch-up. Although not an economist, Bill Clinton was most astute national politician in U.S. history. Understood this viscerally. You mean to tell me, he said to his advisors, that my re-election hinges on the Federal Reserve and a bunch of explicit bond traders? And a bunch of fucking explicit bond traders? Expletive. A bunch of fucking bond traders? He didn't have to be told twice. The charm offensive from Clinton to Greenspan began almost as soon as Clinton was elected. Before his inauguration in December 1992, after Clinton was defeated, Greenspan friend and fellow Republican George H.W. Bush, Clinton invited Greenspan to visit the president-elect's Arkansas headquarters. When they met Little Rock for the first time, Greenspan was impressed. I could see why he reputed to be great retail politician. He wrote in his memoir, he made me believe he really had been looking forward to seeing me. Clinton was there not just to charm the Fed chair, but to hear his advice on Clinton's domestic and economic agenda. The topic was deficit. Greenspan saw the key to Clinton's re-election prospects and the key to economic growth was getting the administration's fiscal house in order. The fiscal conservatism matched the recommendation from influential parts of Clinton's administration and was part of his political image as centrist Democrat. Clinton was sold. It is not terribly surprising that a libertarian central banker, as a fiscal conservative Democrat, would agree on the need to constrain governmental spending. It is more surprising that Clinton's political circulation included making use of the central banker's personal prestige. Clinton's very address to a joint session in Congress in February 93 was unsurprisingly on the economy. Deficit reduction featured prominently in that discussion. Perhaps unsurprisingly too, Clinton didn't say a word about the Fed or monetary policy, but Alan Greenspan was central to that speech in front of a televised audience. Clinton was invited to Greenspan to hear his important address of the presidential personal guest. He sat between Hillary Clinton and Tipper Gore, a symbol of the partnership between Greenspan and Clinton. Greenspan was more a passive partner in the relationship. Just a week after Clinton's inauguration, Greenspan was testified before the Senate on behalf of the president's deficit reduction plan. Clinton had convinced Greenspan that he was serious about the issue, by far the most pressing concern that Greenspan had from his perch at the Federal Reserve. They had committed to a joint expert enterprise. The deficit wasn't the only front of common policy concern. Greenspan enjoyed a close personal relationship with Clinton's economic team, soon headed at the Treasury by Robert Rubin. I know I got